Well, Keith, let's go back to the young man you were before you entered the service. Where did you grow up?
I grew up here in Pasadena. I graduated from Sam Rayburn High School and had no intentions of going to college. And a lot of my friends were joining the service and some had already been drafted, so I called my local draft board and found out who my draft board person was, and I more or less volunteered for the draft. And that was in December 1965 when I got my letter.
You probably had a pretty good idea that you'd be headed to Vietnam after your initial training.
Oh yeah. That's why they were drafting us. I was 20, and it didn't really bother me. Like I said, a lot of my friends were already in Vietnam or going to Vietnam, and I didn't really want to be left out.
Left out, I mean, as youngsters and growing up, we have a kind of a conception of what war is and or what we think it might be. What did you, when you went in, what did you think that it might be?
I remember thinking that it was probably going to be something like World War II, because I'd seen World War II movies, and I pictured a lot of tanks and that type of stuff, and it was totally different, than the terrain in World War II.
Tell me about your training. How did you end up in chopper?
I went through basic at Fort Polk, Louisiana, and then I went through advanced training at Fort Gordon, Georgia. And actually, when I arrived at Fort Gordon, Georgia, I had orders for MP school, and they stopped in front of the MP school, and the sergeant got out and said, "If I call your name, stay on the truck." And mine was the first name he called, and the other guys got off. We asked him what was going on. He said, "Y'all volunteered to go airborne," jumping out of airplanes. And we said, "Yeah," and he said, "Well, y'all going to the infantry." So I had no doubts I was going to Vietnam then. So I took infantry training at Fort Gordon, then I went to jump school at Fort Benning, and I was assigned to the 1st Cav Division as an infantryman in Vietnam. And after I arrived, I was in line waiting to sign in or to register, and they were asking for volunteers for door gunners on helicopters. And about that same time, a helicopter flew over real low, and the guy was waving, and I thought that looked pretty cool, and so I said, "I'd like to volunteer to be a door gunner." That's how I got in.
Tell me about your tour of duty there. How long were you there?
I was there 1 year, from June to June, 66 to 67.
I bet you could write a book about it, but give me a sense of what you experienced.
We flew slicks, Hueys, and we flew, I was in A Company 229th Assault Helicopter Battalion, and what we did was fly infantrymen into LZs, or landing zones, in combat situations. And we didn't get fired at all the time, but most of the time we would receive fire or we could return fire. And it wasn't as glamorous being a door gunner as I thought it was going to be. We saw a lot of death and destruction almost every day, because we would go into different areas where the infantry was and take supplies into them in the morning, and we'd offload the supplies and they'd load the bodies on. And so that's pretty much what we did, was supported the infantry and took them into LZs for air assaults and went and picked them back up. We also assisted with any emergency calls, or we helped dust off, which is the first aid choppers, which are also Hueys, but they're unarmed. We helped them out.
Long way from Pasadena at 20 years old.
Oh yeah, I turned 21 in June, my first month there, and that was the first time I'd seen any casualties. Saw them that morning, and then continued doing our daily flights of, we call them ash and trash runs. And then we had a late call in the evening to take some supplies into some guys, and we landed, and I was handing the supplies off to one of the guys in the helicopter, and he was handing it off to another guy on the ground, and then all of a sudden the guy I was handing the stuff to fell down on the floor, and he had been shot. We were taking fire, and then I told the pilots we were taking fire. We picked up and lifted off, and it was returning fire, and we made a couple of passes, and they came back in when they said it was okay, and had 2 wounded, and then that 1 KIA in the chopper, and then I think 3, maybe 4 prisoners that they had taken. And that was also the first day I'd ever shot anybody. So that was my 21st birthday.
How did you change as a person? Do you change? Are you the same person?
Oh no, you change. You take everything more serious because you see so much death and destruction. You realize it's not a game. You know, you're not over there to have fun. And then when you come back to the States, you just take everything more serious, and you grow up a lot quicker when you've been in a war. These kids that's going to come home from Iraq, they're going to be changed, and they're not going to know what's happening to them, just like we didn't know what was happening to us. You think you're going to come back and just pick up where you left off and be the same old person, and you're not.
The aircraft. I spent many hours.
Oh yeah.
Did you develop some feelings for the aircraft? It was your ride in, your ride out, you went everywhere.
Yeah. I flew on an aircraft we called Triple Nickel. It was, the nose was 555. We call it Triple Nickel, and that was your lifeline, yours and whoever you took out in the field and brought back, and getting on that Huey every morning. Or whenever we got on it was just as natural as if we were getting in a car to go to work. And we depended so much on that Huey, not only for ourselves but for the guys out in the field. Because if we went down, that was 4 more people that they had to worry about picking up, plus the guy, whatever mission we were on wasn't going to get accomplished if we went down. And that happened occasionally.
AirCab, storied history, success story in many ways in an unsuccessful situation. But you had losses. Was your aircraft, I know you were hit, did y'all ever have to make any emergency landings?
Yeah, we I had 2 engine failures and got shot down one time. But when I got shot down, I wasn't very high off the ground, as we were getting mortared back at base camp, and we grouped out in the where the helicopters were to take the infantry back around a mountain. And when we were coming in for a landing, I don't know if it was a hand grenade or what it was, but a big explosion towards the rear of the helicopter on my side, threw it on the tail booth. We just kind of sat down, and the infantry jumped off, and then another chopper came in. When those guys jumped off, we got out of our helicopter and went and got on that one to get out of there. And then I had 2 engine failures. Well, actually 1 engine failure and 1 transmission failure, and we stayed overnight actually on the second on the transmission failure, because the pilots weren't real sure where we were. They had an idea, but they couldn't direct anybody to come in and pick us up, so we spent the night in a ditch. I never even thought about, well, I mean, I was concerned about the enemy, but I never thought about getting captured or anything. I'm glad I wasn't, but never even thought about it.
For those of us who've never experienced war, to wake up every day and realize no rhyme or reason, sheer chance, that this may be your last day, and to lose friends, people. That's got to be a load. Can you tell us how that feels? How do you contend with that?
Actually, I personally didn't think about it. We were so busy. Just had a job to do, an everyday job to do, and you went and did it. And if you got in a firefight, you did your best to not get hit and to not go down. And then that evening, we'd sit around and rehash what happened during the day, and then the next day was just another day. I lost a very good friend in February of '67 in a freak accident, and they were calling for some assistance because they had a KIA, and we were close, so we went in. And what happened is they had an engine failure, and when they landed kind of on an incline, and my friend jumped out, got the pilot out, and then took off running up this hill. The main rotor hit him in the head, and of course killed him instantly. And we had a little service for him that night, and then it was over. You get back to business, and you don't even think about it possibly being you. Things just happen so fast, and you're just so busy all the time. Plus, you just get accustomed to it, and you don't even think about it. You get scared, but you don't really think about when you're going to get killed or if you're going to get killed.
While you were serving there, did you ever question why you were there, or question the orders, or so much has been said by commentators and films and people who weren't there, some who were. But I got to ask you, were you okay with why you were there?
Yeah, whenever I'd go to town, they'd let us go to town. You have women coming up to you trying to give you their babies so that you can take them back home. You understand why you're there, because they don't want their babies raised in that communist country or that poor country. They want a better life for them. And I actually have had women come up to me and beg me to take their baby so I could bring their baby back home. Of course, I couldn't have done that, but they would actually beg and cry. And when we went out to pick up civilians out of a village, because there was going to be a big airstrike, and you see all these poor people scared to death, and that's the only life they know, and you're trying to save their life doing it. It makes it worthwhile. I questioned a few times some of the things that happened, but I guess the leaders, the commanders over me, knew what they were doing, or at least I wanted to think they did. And so I've always supported why we were there, and we were there probably way too long. We were trying to do what we're doing in Iraq, make a better life for those people, and it didn't work out that way. But we gave it our best shot.
Coming back home, what did you find when you got here? And did you bring a lot of what you experienced there with you?
Yeah, you don't realize you do, but you do. Bring a lot of that stuff back with you. I remember when we were waiting to leave, and I got on the airplane to leave, flew out of Pleiku. That was the best feeling in the world. And then as we got close to Oakland, California, one of the officers said that there were going to be protesters there at the airstrip where we were getting off the airplane, and that for us not to say anything to them, and we didn't even know what they were talking about. So like I said, this was mid-1967, and we hadn't heard anything about protesters and about that baby killer thing and all that stuff. When we got off the airplane, we were indoctrinated real quick. They were spitting on you and calling you names, and you just had to suck it up and hurry up and get on into the terminal. And that's when I started wondering why were we being treated that way. I didn't understand it. I landed at Hobby and had my uniform on. I was walking down in the airport, and a guy came up to me and asked me if I just got back from Vietnam, and I said yeah, and he told me I ought to be ashamed of myself. And so I just looked at him, and he walked off, and I still didn't understand what was going on. But then the more I became indoctrinated back into civilian life, I understood that nobody wanted to talk about that war, and that everybody that was over there were druggies and baby killers and like trash. And so, I personally, I didn't wear my uniform. I didn't wear anything that showed that I was in Vietnam. I didn't talk about it, and I didn't even let anybody know wherever I worked that I was in Vietnam, because it was kind of a taboo subject.
Something has happened recently, last couple of years, after 3.5 decades since you flew out. Shadow the Blade project. You took part in that. Can you give me some of your thoughts about it?
Yeah, Cheryl Freeze contacted me about a year before the actual production, and I told her I really wasn't interested. I was still in my don't want to talk about Vietnam mode, and I told her I really wasn't that interested, and she called a couple of times. Well, in the meantime, between the first time she called and the time she called and I said I would do it, I had been reunited with a guy that helped pull out of a LZ one night over there, and there were 7 guys that were wounded pretty bad, and I'd always wondered how many of them lived. And through the internet, I found this guy, and we had emailed each other and talked to each other on the phone. Well, when Cheryl called that last time, I told her I'd be interested in it if there's any way she could reunite me and Connie face to face. And of course, she jumped on that because that's exactly what the project is about: how the Huey affected soldiers and soldiers' relatives, and how it affects them to this day. So Connie and I were reunited here in Pasadena, and he told me that all those fellows had lived, and he was shot 9 times himself and is a paraplegic, but he lived, and so that was one load off my mind, because I'd always wondered about those guys. They were all pretty shot up, and so that was great that they all lived. They wouldn't have lived if we hadn't had the Huey helicopter there to get them out of the boondocks and get them back to a hospital.
Keith, how fresh were the feelings when you were there at that reunion? You saw Connie, and can you put those feelings into words?
No. When that helicopter landed, and I knew Connie and his wife was going to be on it, it was the strangest feeling. It was like, it was so surreal. Like, this isn't really happening, 36 years later, I'm gonna actually meet a guy that I had no idea what his name was, where he lived or anything, and I'm actually gonna meet him. And it was somebody that I actually helped put on a helicopter and, get out of the boonies and back to a hospital. And it was the most awesome feeling, first time I saw him. And we just hugged and hugged, and we'd been talking on the phone, and both of us had said, there's no way we're gonna cry. We're gonna feel like there's no way we're gonna cry. And we were both bawling like babies. His wife was crying, my wife was crying. And I was just so proud of Connie, seeing him, even in a wheelchair. I was just so proud of him. And he's been real successful in life. And even though he's had all these hurdles to overcome, he's been very successful. And he's just got the best outlook on life. If you feel bad and you're around Connie, you won't feel bad long. Because he'll make you feel better.
You feel better about things?
Yeah, I think that more people now are starting to understand about soldiers that were in Vietnam, and that we're all not drug addicts and baby killers and trash that lives on the street that doesn't want to work for a living. I think with documentaries like this, they're going to see families that have lawyers, judges, ministers that were Vietnam veterans, and they're going to see a different side of the Vietnam veteran. And I hope that they'll understand more about what we did when we were there and why we did it, and get over those hard feelings that are still pretty prevalent with some of the anti-war people. The only bitter thing I have is the war protesters. They helped kill a lot of soldiers when they thought they were helping. They drove the morale down so bad that those soldiers, all they thought about was getting out of there and coming home, and they weren't thinking about their job, and they got more killed than what they'll ever realize. That's why I was so glad to see all this protesting on Iraq was ignored by the media, more or less, and it shut them up. Because if you're out in the field and you're fighting a war, and the folks back home aren't supporting you, eventually you're going to feel like you don't want to be there, and you're not concentrating on your job, and it's going to get you killed in a combat situation. I don't have any proof about that, but I just feel like those 10 years of protesting got a lot more people killed than if they hadn't protested.
How did it feel to get back on a Huey?
Oh, it felt great. I wondered about it. I didn't know how I'd feel. It just felt great. I sat in my gun well that I sat in when I was in Vietnam. I hung my feet out the door, and it was the greatest feeling to be able to lift off and buzz around Houston and not have to worry about getting shot at, and just be a part of that production and be a part of that Huey. It was awesome.
I think that's good.
I asked that teacher, do y'all teach anything about Vietnam? He said, we have about 30 minutes of discussion. That's it. And stuff like that hurts your feelings, because that was an important war. I mean, that war is still being talked about, and for the kids not to be taught what it was for and why we were there is wrong.
It's
Holy cow, what kind of war is this? And all they're doing is sitting over there planning and plotting what they're gonna do as soon as their holiday's over. That was something. That's what that political part of it.
That raising regime do anything for us to keep on the best in the country visit.
For not only Americans, but the Vietnamese that are over here that get to go back. I've talked to a lot of Vietnamese in past years that couldn't go back or were afraid to go back. That each country forgives and forgets.